Hi everyone, welcome to today's video, which is going to be how to get started with pantsing or discovery writing if you are an outliner. So first, let's define what an outliner is and what a pantser is. So to outline is to first plot a book before drafting it. The planning can be meticulous or minimal. Outliners have a roadmap for how the events of the book will occur. Whereas to pants is to write by the seat of one's pants. It is also called discovery writing or intuitive writing. The writer does not go into the story with a plan, but writes and creates the plot as they go, hence discovery. So this video is adapted off of an ask that somebody sent to my Tumblr blog, and it was, how can I get started with discovery writing / pantsing? And the short answer to them was, write through the discomfort of not knowing where the story goes and assess as you go if the process works for you, because this does vary so much writer to writer. Pantsing at its core suggests writing with no to minimal plan, so diving in head first can be a great way to break through the newness of the process. But I understand that that can be a really difficult, unhelpful answer. So here are a few tips on how to actually get started with pantsing if you are an outliner. So number one is to start with a diving board. This can be an image, relationship, scenario, or even first line that you write from. Photo prompts can be really helpful for this. I recommend the website Unsplash if you'd like to check out some free stock photography, or you could even use prompt generators for this. If you're not used to writing from absolutely nothing, this is a great exercise because it gives you a springboard to then develop on your own. My only caution here with using prompts of this nature is that it can get really easy to overplan even these tiny tidbits. For example, even though I'm a pantser, when I started writing short fiction, I actually was thinking a lot about the stories, and with thinking came intrinsic planning. I spent weeks coming up with a concept, characters, setting, etc., and basically brainstormed all of the plot points. The reason the story went nowhere is, of course, because I'd never written short fiction, but also because I was literally working against the process of pantsing, which is why it's really important to note, and this leads us to the second point, that discovery writing / pantsing intrinsically calls for spontaneity. You don't have as much spontaneity when you write off an outline, which is why outlining works better for some people, because spontaneity is not needed for their process. Pantsing is not for everybody. If you find yourself being like, but I really don't want to do that, Rachel, that sounds like it's not going to work for me, Rachel, then I don't think that pantsing is necessarily the right process for you. This video is more to talk to people who have been outlining but are interested in discovery writing. But to get philosophical and maybe a little controversial, and noting that this is not a blanket statement, I believe that the process you write with may mirror the type of person you are in your everyday life. Everybody is different, like we're not all the same people, and if you find yourself being more of like a type A organized person, it would probably make sense if you're an outliner. If you're somebody who has never really made plans, doesn't really like goals, pantsing is probably going to be a better alternative for you. And because of its spontaneous nature, pantsing can be intrinsically intimidating. Acceptance of the process's inclination towards spontaneity, though theoretical, might actually help you feel more comfortable. If you already know in advance, well, I'm not really going to know everything in advance, I'm not going to be able to control everything in advance, that might help you create more success because you know what to expect from the process. So my next tip is to meet in the middle, aka pantsing. So perhaps brainstorming settings, characters, and conflict first, and maybe even one plot point to bounce off of before you get into writing. And this might be particularly helpful if you come from a strong outlining background. It could be a less jarring way to transition. Even outlining what happens at the three major act points, like the beginning, midpoint, and end, might give you enough direction while also leaving enough room to brainstorm as you go. So the next tip is that you can plan as much or as little as you need to. Discovery writing doesn't mean that you have zero ideas going into a story, and if you feel you need to start with a few prepared tools rather than your bare hands, that's the way to go. Some pre-planning for a book might look like brainstorming a magic system if your novel requires one. For example, with my contemporary fantasy novel, Seventh Virtue, I could not just make up the magic system as I went. I needed a little bit of information to better how I expressed how the world better worked in this book and around my characters. So the next tip is to start brief. Writing a novel from the seat of your pants for the very first time after you've been a staunch outliner, or in general, can be kind of terrifying, but a flash fiction piece, that could be a little more doable. A short story, that could also be more doable. There's a much smaller space you can first experiment with pantsing instead of going to a 50,000, 60,000, 90,000 word novel. That can be a really, really big leap for anybody to make. My next tip is to understand the differences of each process and how to collaborate with one or both. In my opinion, this is the difference between pantsing and outlining. So pantsing to me is like being a tourist. You're not necessarily sure where you're going next, but you're still being an active participant throughout the tour. Outlining, on the other hand, is being the tour guide. You both experience the exact same thing, but one person is seeing the story for the very first time as it goes, while another has already gotten very familiar with the route and destinations. Not either experience is better than the other. When you really think about it, outlining is basically the exact same thing as pantsing because you pants to create the outline. Like an outline doesn't come out of nowhere. Outlining, however, equips you with an extra tool that helps guide you through the story, and pantsing doesn't have that. What you do for an outline, you do as you're drafting if you're a pantser. I would say customize the process for the way that works best for you. My next tip is to think about writer logic versus writer instinct. So pantsing, in my opinion, relies on writer instincts. As you go through a story, you make decisions and immediately apply them based off of that instinct. Logic becomes subtextual and clarifies once the story or scene is over. It's why when me as a pantser, I'll go through a scene having no idea what the purpose was or what even happened, but after I finish it, it's easier for me to reconcile because when I'm pantsing, logic is not at the forefront, my instincts are. Outlining, on the other hand, first calls on your writer logic, since you've used your instincts already to make the outline. And of course, this is not rigid. You still have instincts and you still have a logic if you're a pantser versus an outliner, but generally speaking, this is how I believe the processes work. Outlining is more application-based, so you've made the decisions already, and now you're using your logic to apply those decisions into the story itself. So this is where I might suggest writing sprints. Doing a quick writing sprint could be a great way to shift from a mindset of outlining, so a more logic-focused mindset, as it encourages you to write whatever comes to mind since you have a clock ticking next to you. Writing sprints may propel you to call upon your writer instincts rather than your writing logic. So my next tip is to note the purpose of each scene/chapter periodically. After writing a scene, take a moment to write out a sentence about what the purpose of that scene in the novel was. What did that scene actually do for the book? Novels are all about movement, but a common thing I hear from writers who've tried pantsing, but it didn't work for them, but they're still like, I want to do it, I just don't understand why it's not working for me, is I just keep writing scenes that do nothing for the development of the book. This is where taking a step back and really reflecting on the scene's grander purpose in your book can be helpful because it highlights what is important for the book and what is extraneous. And it also allows you to better check that every scene you write offers some sort of change for the book going forward. If you've already hit the purpose of a scene once in a book before, you probably don't need to repeat it. My next tip is to allow yourself time to digest/reflect as you go. Both outlining and pantsing can be similarly time consuming, but the difference is in when that time is allotted. Outliners may take a few weeks or a few months to outline their book before they even get to draft, and pantsers may take the exact amount of time that outliners use to create their outline to allow the project to breathe, to take breaks in essence, and process what's going on in the book. Pantsing can be really difficult because it can be disorienting to not fully understand or fully grasp where a story is going when you write it. This is where breaks are important when you pants. If you feel uncertain about a scene or a chapter, it's better to let it rest and come back with fresh eyes a few weeks later or a few days later even. My next tip is to reread your work often and track scenes as you go. Outliners may not need to reread their work as often as pantsers because they have an outline that tells them what's happened in the book so far. And one of the most difficult parts, I think, of being a pantser for me is forgetting the emotional places I left the last time that I wrote. This is why I take about 5 to 10 minutes at the start of every single writing session to reread what I wrote, because this kind of organically transports me back to the mindset I was in. Creating an outline as you go can actually be really helpful, just as like a literal remembrance tool. I go through and I list every single scene that's in the book because it's much faster than rereading everything that you wrote. And my final tip is don't finish your scenes. So this writing advice probably sounds really crazy or a little wild. A difficult part of pantsing is momentum, and I think if you're an outliner and you know everything that's going to happen, naturally you have more momentum because you know what's going to happen. You don't have to sit down and think, well, what happens next? The question really is, what do I do if I can't figure out what happens next? Completing scenes every session can actually make this worry a little bit more difficult, because now you have to come up with a brand new idea on the spot, basically. This is why I recommend not finishing your scenes during a session, because you have a place to jump off for next time. So sometimes setting yourself up for success is not finishing the scene from the day before. Or conversely, if you're really on a roll and you don't want to just cut off writing your scene in the middle of it, you can write the first sentence or two of the next scene for the next day just to get you going. So now I'm going to be answering a few of your questions. The first question is, how do you discovery write long stories / novels? I really do think it's important to go back and to really think about the purpose of the scenes that you've written, and to try to write a scene that is facilitated by the previous one. So if I'm thinking, oh, okay, so this paragraph happened, what constitutes the next paragraph now? So what happened previously that is now leading me to the current scene? How do you know whether you took the wrong decision somewhere in the text or whether you just have to pull through? So the answer is, in a lot of ways, intuition. Something earlier in the story is usually wrong if you're struggling in the present. If you're currently at this point in the story where you're really struggling and nothing is working, there's probably something wrong much earlier. So reread what you last wrote. Is there like a gut reaction you feel to, oh, this shouldn't have happened? Usually I have that feeling. Usually I want to push that feeling away because it requires a lot more work to then go and revise something. But it is important, if you are rereading something, you're like, oh, that doesn't feel right, follow that instinct. The next question is, how do I pants a story if I know nothing about the characters? If you are unsure about how to start writing with the character, I would also recommend doing some brainstorming. Like I said, hack the process, make it work for you, really. Let the character make decisions. Sometimes I can second guess what my characters are doing, like, oh, I wouldn't do that, or oh, would they say that? Just write the first thing that comes to mind and see where that takes you in the exploration. Sometimes you get things wrong. Sometimes you go down the wrong path, you think the wrong things about a character, and so understanding that changes happen and you're probably gonna have to make some revisions to the beginning could be a little bit, I guess, calming. But what's great is the more you write with somebody, the better you get to know them. I hope that this was helpful for outliners who are interested in pantsing. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in another video. Bye!